Good morning. I'm sitting up here just because I've got my computer and I can't read and hold a microphone at the same time. So our panel has a fun task. We each have 5 minutes to summarize 3 hours of presentations, and then with 8 minutes to go, we were asked to walk around the room and read the Post-it notes that you all have put up. So it's a high challenge, and I'm sure that we'll miss quite a bit, but we're focusing on 4 specific questions. And these all have to do with the challenge that's up there on the wall. And I, in particular, am focusing on the third one down there that has more to do with the addressing conflicting visions and underlying power imbalances among stakeholders across the basin. So our 4 specific questions, and each of us is going to take a different take on these 4, are to identify lessons learned, obstacles, alternative pathways, and some positive agenda suggestions. So my observations after this session have to do regarding lessons learned and obstacles. Focusing on a couple of things, actually 3 things I think that I didn't hear as much about as I think that we should have. I'm writing this as I go along. As you can see, it's a work in progress. One has to do with the issue of conflict. I think that Cesar put up something on his slide there about the violence, but I haven't heard enough, and I'm concerned that I haven't heard enough over these last couple of days about the individual and institutionalized violence against local populations in the Amazon. Global Witness ranks several of the Amazon countries in the top 10 across the world in terms of the killings of environmental defenders. Another issue in that vein is an obstacle and a lesson learned is trafficking in persons, men, women, youth, and children, not only in areas of illegal gold mining, but in border zones for other nefarious purposes. I think it's something on which we need to be much more attentive and form some partnerships with some non-traditional partners who work on social justice issues and whatnot. The second of my 3rd obstacles, or kind of lessons learned, has to do with the obvious one. The second one has to do with the obvious one of corruption. Our good governance tools and strategies have been effectively used in getting some appointed officials out of office. We saw that earlier with Obama. I think that was with Beto Monchi and the licensing. But there's still so much work to do. And so some ongoing obstacles. Rob mentioned the invisibility of wildlife trafficking, something that doesn't get due attention either I think by us or the people that we're trying to influence. And also the insidious connections among illegal logging, illegal gold mining, narco trafficking, and again, trafficking in persons. It's a real web, and it's filthy and dirty and dangerous out there. And we're not closing our eyes to it, but I think that the reality of the violence in many of the conservation and development scenarios that we're working in and landscapes, and we need to be more upfront about the reality of that for the people who live there and what needs to happen. My 3rd and final obstacle, something that I would like us to see more attention to and being more inclusive about, are non-Indigenous communities, local communities who are not Indigenous. Whose was it? Was it Beto? I've forgotten now. Who said that the majority of deforestation is in agricultural zones. I mean, non-Indigenous zones, and so we oftentimes don't, again, focus enough on the Caboclo or the Riverino or the roadside communities, be they migrants or people who've been there for a while. And yes, they don't have the cachet of being Indigenous, nor do they have huge territories under their management responsibility. But if that's where the threat is, and those are the people's behaviors we want to change, I think we need to do a better job on that. Looking more towards the future, looking for alternative pathways and some suggestions for a positive agenda. And I got 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go really fast. Some alternative pathways or opportunities. The Colombian peace process. I see it as both a priority and an opportunity for an alternative pathway. How can we apply some of these governance tools and strategies and avoid some of the land grabbing, conflict, and deforestation, and generate low carbon economies, economic alternatives? Do we have our eye on the ball on that one? I didn't hear much here in this workshop about that. Some alternative pathways for corruption in electoral politics. As a U.S. citizen, who am I to talk about voter education and choosing wisely? But resist and organize. Voter education and empowerment. We just keep electing crooks and thieves everywhere. And so how do you avoid that? Resist Amazonia is a great rallying cry, but that success depends on having well-informed and well-organized voters. So alternative pathways, electoral social media campaigns, use the immediacy of communications, as our Brazilian colleagues talked about with the FLONA reduction and whatnot. Candidate education and accountability. SPDA and Ecolex and others do public forums with candidates, getting them to step out there and say what they're going to do, and people can vote accordingly. Thirdly, alternative pathways, independent evaluation committees and associations, hydropower monitoring, getting a committee that's going to keep an eye on the hydrovia. Mariano's president of the new Peruvian Association for Environmental Impact Studies, and so using some of that objective, science-based, and transparency tools to help us keep an eye on that. 1 minute, positive agenda. Okay, for this one we were asked, as we all were, to step out of our comfort zone. I've got 4 things here, real quick. 1, human rights and conservation. We've got to expose and combat that violent conflict that results from land grabbing and struggles over land titles. We can't avoid that and pretend it's not happening. Too many of the people that we've worked with and we're working for are being murdered and have experienced violence in other ways. You know me, gender, I couldn't get away without saying gender. The obvious ones, we need more research about access and control, but secondly, I would talk about women and youth empowerment, and particularly helping women, adolescent girls and boys effectively use their voice and votes. You know, my comfort zone, I love sitting in a conference room and listening to the indigenous women go on and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But I realize that I'm getting tired of hearing the same old diatribe over and over every time an indigenous woman, with all due respect, gets a microphone in her hand. If we're in a climate change conference, if we're in something talking about education, you know, microphone, and 10 minutes later she's still going on and on and on. So that's starting to fall on deaf ears. So how to educate women in particular to be effective public speakers and use their voice and vote effectively. Last 2 ones, following the money. Engage with investors early on. We've got some great models of public-private partnerships, and the mitigation hierarchy that we just saw seems an excellent way to go. As Rob said, don't demonize, collaborate. And I would suggest that we turn our success in working with the big soy and cattle and multilateral development banks in Brazil and elsewhere into a strategic approach to analyze, engage, and influence the Chinese investment in the region. Okay, the last is the big one we're all talking about, strategic communications. Identify our target audiences. Whose behavior do we want to change? Social media, we're going beyond our comfort zone. How many of us here have Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat? I mean, I have them all. Don't use them. Don't go and see how inactive my accounts are. And then symbols and mascots. Rob reminded us wildlife trafficking, the jaguar and whatnot. What are those images and places that are going to awaken those urban communities and urban youth so that we've got the conservation constituency that we need to get that positive agenda going forward? And before Charo just yanks me off the stage, I will now close. Thank you.
Good morning. Sorry about my sexy voice. Bien, reaccionando a los diferentes presentaciones y sobre todo considerando algunos elementos en materia de gobernanza para la Amazonía, me gustaría introducir y complementar de alguna manera con 5 puntos respecto de lo que hemos escuchado y compartido en estos días. Lo primero es que creo que debemos reconocer en América Latina y en particular en la Amazonía un fracaso de los sistemas de ordenamiento territorial. Creo que los niveles de planificación de uso del suelo en nuestros países se han hecho de una manera poco técnica, con muy poca participación y desde una visión política que no ha tenido ni siquiera financiamiento, ni un respaldo institucional ni normativo en muchos casos. Esto lo que hace es muchas de las consecuencias que vemos en nuestros países. ¿Por qué digo esto que puede sonar como muy tecnócrata? Pero una vez escuché a un dirigente cofán de una comunidad indígena en Ecuador, en la comunidad de Sábalo, en la Amazonía. Ellos tienen una zonificación en 5 zonas y tienen un área para cacería. Nos contaba el jefe de la comunidad que un grupo de cazadores cofanes estaban persiguiendo un animal en la Amazonía. Cuando el animal cruzó a la otra zona, lo dejaron de seguir. Eso no sucede en nuestros países, eso no sucede con nuestras áreas protegidas, eso no sucede con nuestros sistemas. Entonces ahí tenemos que reconocer que hay un elemento. Mínimamente el ordenamiento territorial debería recoger al menos 3 ámbitos fundamentales. Uno, el tema de tenencia de la tierra. Creo que es fundamental que los actores locales, las comunidades, sientan y tengan el derecho pleno a entrar en procesos de negociación o en procesos de diálogo, pero a partir de ser propietarios de la tierra. Es muy difícil una negociación o tratar de disminuir los desbalances de poder si la gente local habla desde la posesión, habla desde la informalidad, habla desde la falta de derechos. Un segundo elemento en esa materia es lo relativo a los marcos legales en la región. Es muy fácil entender ahora que vemos algunos casos de países, por lo que todos conocemos, cada país de la cuenca amazónica tiene marcos legales distintos. No hay un esfuerzo serio de tener un marco legal regional vinculante, obligatorio, para los países y para los gobiernos, que dé luces claras sobre la conservación de la Amazonía a largo plazo y el respeto de derechos humanos a los pueblos y comunidades de la región amazónica. Los organismos de integración regional han tenido muy poca eficacia y han sido altamente politizados en lograr este objetivo. Por tanto, todavía nos queda pendiente una tarea en fortalecer los marcos legales de nivel nacional y, sobre todo, una coherencia a nivel regional y de manera vinculante. Un tercer elemento que quisiera compartirles es el tema de incentivos. Creo que es fundamental no dejar de lado el tema de incentivos en la cuenca amazónica. En Ecuador tenemos un ejemplo, es el tema de Sociobosque, muchos de ustedes lo habrán oído. No es un programa perfecto, se ha politizado en algunos momentos, se ha desfinanciado en otros, pero vive, está vivo y ha tenido un impacto positivo en la disminución de la deforestación en el país. Pero ¿por qué lo remarco en particular? Porque este tiene una obligación estatal financiera respecto del incentivo. Es decir, todos los esfuerzos que hacemos como sociedad civil, como organizaciones de conservación nacional o internacionales, es importante y hay que seguirlo haciendo. Sin embargo, los estados, de la misma manera como se privilegia o se debería privilegiar salud, educación, creo que la conservación debe ser parte del financiamiento público y los incentivos no deberían ser vistos, por tanto, como un objetivo, sino como exigir un derecho. Un tercer elemento en esta línea que quisiera compartirles es lo que Pedro mencionó en su presentación y lo quisiera remarcar, el tema de la coordinación intersectorial, que creo que Connie también lo mencionó, creo que es un tema fundamental en el tema de cómo disminuir estos desbalances de poder. Pero antes de entrar en esta búsqueda de acuerdos entre los sectores, yo sí me quisiera detener en lo que está pasando en sociedad civil en la región. Creo que muchos gobiernos, y ya no importa la ideología, si es de derecha o de izquierda, han hecho una contribución franca en disminuir la capacidad organizativa de la sociedad civil en la región. Por tanto, para entrar en una coordinación intersectorial, es importante, por ahora, romper el desbalance que se ha generado. Hay cifras alarmantes en la región, aparte de la persecución de defensores, en términos de desaparición de organizaciones de la sociedad civil, sean ONGs, sean sindicatos, sean organizaciones indígenas representativas. Ese desbalance, esa desestabilización y atomización, y una palabra que está muy de moda en la región, la ciudadanización de la participación. Esto lo que implica es que las organizaciones ya no tienen la capacidad de hablar a través del colectivo, sino a través del individuo. Cada individuo ahora tiene que expresar su derecho. Esa es la ciudadanización. Y eso es un tema que atañe a nuestros temas porque dificulta los procesos de ejercicio de derechos como el de consulta previa. Cuando no tienes un colectivo organizado, cuando no hay una fortaleza organizacional en la sociedad civil, estos derechos, el ejercicio de estos derechos se pierden y se disminuyen. Y un último tema es lo relacionado a la visión de desarrollo. Mucho de lo que hemos visto aquí, la compañera de Bolivia lo ha remarcado, hay mucha visión de Lima, de Quito, de Bogotá, de Brasilia, sobre los territorios. Eso es verdad. Eso nos evoca aquella dicotomía que nos planteaban hace algunos años en la sociología, lo de la metrópoli y la periferia. Creo que de la misma manera como nuestros países en el sur son la periferia del norte, en la Amazonía también es la periferia de las metrópolis, de las capitales de nuestros países, de los centros de decisión política. Y ahí creo que hay que atacar entonces también el tema de los modelos de desarrollo. Si no tenemos la posibilidad de a través de nuestras acciones promover un modelo de desarrollo desde la base, desde las comunidades, desde el trabajo y de los actores territoriales, que también lo son privados, que también lo son colonos, que también lo son campesinos, pero que son principalmente los dueños del territorio. En el caso de Ecuador, los pueblos indígenas sobre el territorio nacional son propietarios del 60% del territorio nacional. Y en el caso de la Amazonía, es propiedad de los pueblos indígenas del 75%. Entonces, si no pueden hablar casi los mayoritarios dueños del territorio amazónico sobre el modelo de desarrollo que quieren a largo plazo, entonces ahí hay una dificultad y creo que debe ser un tema parte de nuestra agenda. Muchas gracias.
I was asked to give a positive, negative spin on what I've heard during these last couple of days and try to identify what happened in the past, what was done in the past that caused us to get to this point where we are now, having these major challenges. And when I look at that first challenge, I think I would put it less rhetorically and say, yes, we can. Because obviously we wouldn't be here unless we all thought we could meet that challenge. And the obvious question is, how do we do that? And among the main groups that are here, foundations, NGOs, and universities, who's going to drive this new paradigm? And Avisita mentioned something very interesting this morning, that there's a white elephant in the room. A white elephant. And by that, she meant foundations. And what we've seen historically in the Amazon, whatever the priorities are of a foundation, that becomes what every NGO, every university does. And so this has to be really well thought out, because we depend on each one of those major categories, those institutions, to have their own ideas, and they need to be really different. Universities traditionally are the ones that develop, I would say, the most novel ideas, and I think they will continue to do that. NGOs are more oriented to implement those ideas, I think, because universities are a different type of institution. But the role of foundations, especially considering the incredible foundations in the United States that finance a lot of stuff, they have a very, very serious role in all of this. Because we can develop any new paradigm we want, and if it never gets financed, it's not going to happen. And over the years, everybody has, each decade the paradigm changes. You know, you go back to the 70s, it's completely different now than what people try to do. But I think overall, the overarching problem that we had was a scale. How do you confront scale and get to scale over time? And beginning in the 1990s, there was a very important development called community management. The problem is everybody fell in love with just that one thing. And we did integrate it, especially with the urban center, different countries, large regional levels. And I think no matter what we define this challenge as now, the scale is going to have to be there. And we're usually talking about the Amazon basin, but we're also talking about Amazon in the sense of the rainforest, which includes the Guianas and parts of Venezuela, as Carlos Norbury outlined very well because of its importance in the hydrological cycle across the Amazon and the importance of the rainforest in maintaining that. So we have these two enormous polygons. And so each actor, each stakeholder has to kind of define where do they fit into that whole thing in a very explicit way. What is their importance? Indigenous areas, for example, what do they actually represent in terms of helping maintaining the hydrological cycle, the rainforest and the like, and the protected areas? So I see the challenge, how can we actually cooperate at large regional levels? And looking at Charo there, Charo's been like following me around for years. She shows up in places. I opened up a curtain once in Lima, and she was behind it. It scared the hell out of me. Chances of that happening. But I was thinking a lot about communication and the great weakness in communication between the rural areas, indigenous areas, and urban areas. And I'd like to take Charo and John and clone them and get them out there to build those bridges. You know, who are going to be these people that build those bridges? They have this communication between all of that. And Pedro happens to be here in the front, and I was very excited over the years to be able to interact a lot with SFDA in Lima, de Sociedad de Derechos Ambientales Peruano. And the legal aspects of this, I think academics have kind of been afraid in general, more in Brazil, perhaps in other places, to really develop, legal NGOs or within universities and the like that can actually communicate what scientists do. We were criticized a lot. Well, you guys aren't, dealing with this at a legal level. We're not lawyers, I mean, scientists aren't lawyers. And once we began talking with Pedro and Mariano somewhere here, very didactic guys, we actually learned how it has to be done. It has to be done through people like this that actually understand the legal system. And it's not going to just float up from the bottom, which a lot of community management all like. It's going to be a combination of all those things and bringing them together. And I think it's these communicators. We don't need the communicators here especially. We need them out there in the field. And so I think maybe Mariana can come out of Marianne can come out of retirement and figure out, because you're going to have to springboard off community management to make this happen. And community management did develop the process and the methods to talk to these local communities. And so from there to springboard up to the urban areas, even at the country levels, I think is the next really, really big challenge in order to meet this challenge as well. Thank you.
Good morning, just barely. Thanks to the faculty and students here for hosting me and everybody else. So I was inspired, as many of you, I think, were by David's speech yesterday, putting the lie to the idea that there are only one or two communicators in the room. And further encouraged today to talk about that topic and to interpret literally the theme of today, which is negotiating governance. We haven't talked about negotiation as a formal process, and there is a science, I'm going to put it in quotes, of negotiation. So what I want to do is talk about 3 central concepts in negotiation, and then end with lots of hopeful, positive things that we can do to be each one of us as a protagonist in the conservation movement, better negotiators for conservation. So, and this is really basic stuff for anyone who's been exposed to a negotiation course or the theory around this. But the first concept is interests. And the fundamental first step in a good negotiation is to understand the interests of the person you're negotiating with. And so if you think about that as a 2-circle Venn diagram, here are your interests. This is your vision for conservation and sustainable development. And here are the interests of the people you need to negotiate with to get to this Amazon that we want. And you may be driven by your ideology to think that life is one big win-win situation, and we all are basically good people who want the same thing. So you may draw those circles as almost the one on top of the other, and think that just information is keeping us from recognizing that. Or you may see the world as a melodrama of good versus evil, and the circles aren't even touching or they're tangent. It's important to get past those ideologies and really understand what are the interests of the people I'm talking to. And I want to give a shout to Sarela for the comment about feasibility studies. I'm a practitioner of economics. I haven't heard much about my field the last couple of days. But the idea of like getting into the guts of a feasibility study and really understanding what's driving the kind of development that we're troubled by is extremely important, in addition to all of the empathy and stuff that was mentioned yesterday by David. So who are those people? It's agribusiness, it's small farmers, it's indigenous people, it's mining companies, it's small-scale miners, it's ministries of every description, it's development banks, and each one of these actors is different. So careful analysis of who they are and what your power balance with them is. Where are the sources of your power? What are the sources of their power? How imbalanced is that? How can you increase the sources of your power? So that's in negotiation analysis called the ZOPA, Zone of Possible Agreement. And it's important that it includes both things that you and your counterpart agree on and things that you want and your counterpart is indifferent about. And you have to look for those things that can be done that don't take away from their benefits, but they're glad to give in a negotiation. The second concept is the alternative to a negotiated agreement, the famous best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What happens to the mining company or the agribusiness company or the dam builder or the Ministry of Transport if they don't negotiate with you? A lot of times they think their alternative is pretty good. They don't need to negotiate with you. How can you change their alternative through protests, through enforcing legal norms, through making it hurt to not come to the table and negotiate sustainable development? And the third concept is the enforceability of whatever kind of agreement gets worked out. So we've heard over and over again how there's been good progress with companies, there's been good progress with governments, and then on the ground, we don't see the results. So what are the mechanisms to make your agreement enforceable? You leave the table and you know that either through some change in the law, a regulation, a trust fund, establishment of a protected area, demarcation of an indigenous area, or some other enforceable mechanism in an environmental impact assessment enshrines your agreement in a way that you can come back and demand that it be enforced over time. So given that background, I think there are 6 good things that we can do to increase our ability to negotiate the kind of future that Mauricio laid out this morning, or that many of you have that are different from his vision, but have a large degree of overlap. First is just understanding interests without bias. And a lot of this is we have to be, each one of us, an amateur anthropologist when interacting with different people. But there's a technical side to this too. And I think we need to drill deep on the economics of all these things that we're trying to change. And there has to be some rigor behind a vision for a new development paradigm in the Amazon. What does that mean? How viable are the businesses? How much do the public policies need to tilt the scales in favor of that vision? Second, make your counterparts' best alternative to a negotiated agreement worse. Do this by rallying public support. Do this by passing legislation. Do this by supporting the public prosecutor's office, the Defensoria, whatever the mechanism is in your context, to make walking away from the table more expensive for a developer. Third, get smarter about the culture of your negotiating partners. Understand the jargon of energy and transportation and agriculture and macroeconomics and exports and all this stuff, and use that jargon and go and talk to them and be able to have a conversation of equals. But also the byproduct of that is it'll increase your empathy for what they're trying to do, which is often a totally legitimate social economic goal. Overcome obstacles to dialogue. This is sort of related to the previous point, but I really shouldn't have worn this kind of outfit to this group. Just as an example, I'm just trying to keep up with Mariano Castro, but think about how you talk, how you present, and how you engage with those decision makers. And a great example of this is Richard Holbrooke in the Balkans negotiations of the 1990s, just bridging those behavior gaps to bring people together. Almost done. Change the power balance, and this really is another way of saying make the BATNA worse for your negotiating partner. And finally, the last point is make sure you're talking to the right person. It's often tempting to talk to whoever will talk to us, but we should be always trying to push the envelope on talking to people who actually make decisions. So that's what I have to say. Thanks very much.